Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Foodie Friday. Earlier this week I threw a question out into one of the forums at Raw Food Rehab asking for ideas of what you all would like to see me making on Foodie Friday this week. And I did get a couple of responses and emails, and one of the ideas or questions was, what can I make that's raw with pumpkin? It's the perfect time of the year to answer that question. And so as I started working on that and doing some research behind the scenes, I realized that I had too many ideas for recipes with pumpkin to just fit into one episode. So this Friday and next Friday, it's the Great Pumpkin episode, parts 1 and 2. I started preparing for today's episode yesterday because when you're working with raw pumpkin, one of the things that I have found that makes it much more palatable is to shred the pumpkin or grate the pumpkin and to soak it overnight. So it's really easy to do that, and I've taken lots of photographs over the last 24 hours as I've been working in the kitchen, and so part of this is going to be filmed today, but then I'm also going to share with you photographs, step by step, of how I put some things together. So what's on the menu today? Well, first of all, we're going to have pumpkin cookies with caramel icing. Then a recipe that doesn't actually contain pumpkin, although it does have pumpkin sprinkles on one of them. It is a recipe out of Falling Into Raw for chocolate fudgy brownies, and I've sort of recreated the recipe and turned them into fudge cookies for your kids for Halloween. And then I'm also trying my hand at a creamy pumpkin pie with graham cracker crust. I'm real excited, and I'm very hopeful that this is going to turn out well. So let's go into the raw food kitchen and check it out. Come on. What I meant to say in the last segment is that I'm making a creamy pumpkin pie with a Gingersnap crust. Let me show you the ingredients that I've put together for the crust. That's what we're going to make first today. I've got some spices, ginger obviously, cloves, cinnamon, and a little bit of nutmeg. I have 5 medjool dates that have been pitted. They're soft. I've got some blackstrap molasses. It is unsulfured. And I've got 2 tablespoons of that. I'm going to put a splash of organic vanilla extract and 1 cup each of cashews and pecans. Those have not been soaked. I want them dry as I'm making the crust. And then I'm going to add in just a little pinch of sea salt. We're going to put all of this into my Cuisinart food processor and make the crust. Just as a side note, when I make my crusts, I take the nuts first, dry, and I blend them until they just get pretty fine, not powdery, but they get into just a very crumbled crust. So we do that first, and then I will add the other ingredients to the mix. It just really helps me get the consistency to the crust that I'm looking for. Okay, you can see that I've got all the ingredients, and they really have formed like a sticky little consistency that's going to stay together really well. Now, I'm going to use my favorite pan for this type of a recipe, and this is, I don't even know what this is called. It's not a springform pan, but basically what I do is I will take the crust ingredients and I will press it down into the bottom of this pan. This crust is just a little bit stickier than usual, and I'm sure it's because of the molasses. So I could do one of 2 things. I could add a little bit of dried nut pulp, like almond pulp, to it to dry it up a little bit. Or I could add this pressed crust into my dehydrator for just a little bit, which for the effect of this pie, that's what I think I'm going to do. While I'm making other things, I'm just going to let this crust sit in a warm dehydrator for a little bit. And then I may sprinkle the top of it with a little bit of dried almond pulp just to give it a little bit better texture before I add the filling. One of the things I noticed as I was pressing this crust into the pan is that a considerable amount of moisture was coming up as I was pressing it down. It feels to me that it's a combination of the oil from the nuts as well as the liquid of the molasses and the vanilla extract. So what I do in a situation like this is I will take paper towels and I'm just going to press that down on the crust to remove as much of that liquid as I can. Then I'll put it into a warm dehydrator for about an hour as I'm preparing the filling and then doing other things in the kitchen as well. If you don't have a dehydrator, you could certainly put your oven on the very lowest setting, or like if you have a warm setting, and you could even leave the door cracked just a little bit, because I'm really wanting to try to make this as close to a traditional pumpkin pie as possible. So doing the finish in a warm oven or a dehydrator on this crust is going to make a big difference. Okay, now let's put together the ingredients for the filling of the creamy pumpkin pie. First of all, I want to show you the size of the pumpkin that I picked up at the grocery store. This is one of those little sweet sugar pumpkins that's ideal for a pumpkin pie. I peeled it, sliced it, just almost like you would slice a cantaloupe or a honeydew melon, you know, taking the seeds out of it. And then with the slices, I fed it through my food processor using the grate plate. You could certainly use a box grater or just a handheld grater. And you can see, here is the grated pumpkin. And I soaked this overnight. Now, the situation with this is that you're wanting to try to extract some of the starchiness out of the pumpkin to make it more palatable, since we're going to be serving it raw, blending it raw. So here are the ingredients. I've got 5 cups of soaked overnight and drained shredded pumpkin. The recipe calls for 1/2 cup of young Thai coconut meat. If you don't have young Thai coconut meat, you could certainly soak cashews or macadamia nuts and soak those overnight to blend in with. This is coconut oil. The recipe calls for coconut butter, which I think would be a better choice. I just happen to be out of it right now, so we're going to use coconut oil. And then I have 1 tablespoon of pumpkin pie spice, a tablespoon of psyllium husk, which is optional. I think I'm just using that to help bind the ingredients together to give it a thicker, creamier flavor. And then 1/2 cup each of raw agave nectar and maple syrup. I'm going to add all these ingredients into my blender and create the filling. The filling blended really well. The first thing I put in was the sweetener so that the liquid was on the bottom. Then I added the coconut meat and the coconut oil, the spices, and then I put the pumpkin on top of that, blended the whole thing until it was smooth, and then added the psyllium husk at the end. So we're going to take this filling and add it to our prepared pie crust, and then I'm going to store this in the freezer while I make the whipped cream topping. So this is going to be so good. I can't wait to show you the finished pie. This next recipe is for pumpkin cookies with caramel icing. And this is the first time I've ever made it. I kind of came up with this recipe. I get a lot of people who write wanting to know, what do I do with all this pulp that I'm creating when I either juice or I'm making nut milk? So this recipe calls for 1 cup of almond pulp. And you don't need to dry it, you just use it wet. So it has the pulp, it has 1/3 cup of ground golden flax seeds, 1 heaping cup of the shredded soaked pumpkin that I showed you earlier, 2/3 cup of date paste. Now, you probably know what date paste is, but in case you don't, let me give you a little show here of it. You just take dates, pit them, soak them in water, and then blend them in your blender. And that is date paste. So this recipe calls for 2/3 cup of date paste. So it's a natural fruit sugar, which is probably better than a lot of other sugars that we could use in cookies. You're also going to add 2 tablespoons of maple syrup, some cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, and cloves, and here they are. What I did is I just spread out the batter on one of these. This is just a Teflon sheet. And I just spread the batter out with an offset spatula, which you'll see in the slideshow of photos, and put it in the dehydrator for several hours. I don't remember exactly how many hours it was. Flipped it over once it had solidified and firmed up a little bit, and just used a round cookie cutter to cut these. And they're not quite finished. They're pretty close. We don't want them to get crispy, or at least I don't. So what we're going to do is continue dehydrating these while we make our caramel sauce. Caramel sauce is super easy. I've got 1/4 cup of soaked cashews, 2 tablespoons of date paste, 1/4 cup of simple nut milk, which the recipe for this is in Falling into Raw. And then, let's see, what do I have? 2 tablespoons each of maple syrup, The other is 2 tablespoons of dark raw agave nectar. So I'll put all of those ingredients into my blender, and it's going to create the most delicious caramel sauce. The recipe for the caramel sauce, you can find it also in Falling Into Raw on page 47 of the recipe section. Yummy caramel sauce. I did add a heaping teaspoon of coconut oil to this recipe, and now I'm going to put it in the refrigerator and let it firm up just a little bit, because I really want it to end up having the consistency of icing. So as my pumpkin cookies are finishing dehydrating, we're going to let this firm up in the refrigerator just a little bit. This last recipe is from Falling Into Raw on page 48. It's for chocolate brownie fudge. And instead of making it into square fudge shapes, I took the batter and rolled it in between 2 non-stick Teflon sheets from my dehydrator and rolled it out almost like I was going to roll out cookie dough. And this is what happened. I found some Halloween cookie cutters that I had stashed back, and I cut it into shapes. We've got a little ghost and a couple of moons, and there's a little witch riding on her broom. And so just made it into cookies, chocolate fudge cookies. I've coated these in a couple of different things. Obviously, you see that we have finely ground coconut flakes. We also have some mesquite powder. I used lucuma powder on a few. And then this is my favorite. I took some of that shredded pumpkin that I did yesterday, dehydrated it, and then put it into the Vitamix to basically make dried pumpkin sprinkles. So isn't that cool? So you guys I encourage you to have fun with recipes, get as creative as you can, and so this is going to be a lot better snack for the kids than the little candy bars. So I encourage you to check it out and see what you think. Here are the finished pumpkin cookies. You can see that I've just pulled those out of the dehydrator, and I've taken that caramel sauce and iced the top, and then used a little bit of my pumpkin sprinkles just for a decorative effect. Guys, I'm going to have to taste one, okay? Going to have to see what it tastes like. Oh my gosh. It's really good. I don't usually like dehydrated cookies. I left them just soft enough. I dehydrated them just until the exterior was just a little bit firm, but the inside is still soft. It's really delicious. You're going to have to make those. Well, I thought I would show you. I don't know if you can really get a good visual on that, but that is our pumpkin pie in the freezer. Still setting up. I just checked it. You can see my little fingerprint right there in the top of it. It's not quite ready to pull out and cut and serve yet, but while we're continuing to wait on that, I thought we'd go ahead and put together some whipped cream, because, you know, pumpkin pie is not pumpkin pie without whipped cream. So I've got 1 cup of soaked cashews. I soaked them for like 2 hours probably, because I kind of thought about it after the fact. I have 1/2 of a cup of coconut meat. If you don't have coconut meat, you could certainly use more nuts. I have probably a heaping teaspoon of coconut oil, because that's just going to help this come together and firm up a little bit. I have 1/4 of a cup of raw agave nectar, and then I'll put in 2 teaspoons of organic vanilla extract. We're just going to put this into a blender and whip it into whipped cream. Well, guys, it's been a full afternoon of pumpkin fun. This creamy pumpkin pie with Gingersnap Crust and vanilla whipped cream is to live for. I'm telling you, you'll want to make it. It's a winner. See you next week for the Great Pumpkin episode part 2. See you then.